Alright. Oh shit, I don't have to push to talk. Let me just change that. Alright, that should be good. Alright, you guys hear me fine? Yes? No?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Alright. Hello everybody. It's Sino Sunday, or Sino Sunday. How do you say that? Is it Sino? Hello?
Sino.
Sino.
Yeah.
It's been a while. What, like 2 years? More than 2 years? It's been a long time since we did anything theory reading and uploaded anything. Anyways, title is Jiang Shigong's Chinese World Order. This is interesting. This was given to me by Tree. I don't know how Tree finds these things, but Tree is knowledgeable in all things world political and communistic to a far greater extent than I ever am. So we're just going to read this. I've already read it. It's very interesting. Jiang Shigong is one of the people around Xi Jinping. As far as Tree let me know, this is one of the guys that's kind of one of the close comrades of theory with Xi Jinping. He's one of the faces of Xi Jinping thought. And so his own philosophies and theories certainly have to impact Xi Jinping, and impacting Xi Jinping means you're impacting the way China is going. So if you want to know where China's going, this is a good place to look. Because I don't know about you, I read this, and I think since you guys haven't read it yet, but as you read it, you'll notice that this is definitely not what you would expect by the standard assumptions people have about what Chinese philosophy is. I mean, I look around at stuff like on subreddits like Ask Philosophy and other philosophy places, and insofar as people know that there is such a thing as Chinese philosophy, all they literally know is about Confucius, Taoism. There's a couple others whose name I can't remember right now, but they all have to do mostly with political philosophy, either spirituality, and sometimes with metaphysics. But this, as you read it, this is very modern. This is clearly somebody who is very conversant with Western philosophy as much as probably they're far more conversant with Eastern philosophy than we ever are. And my dog suddenly has desire to go out, so give me a second.
I don't know, not too surprised by the idea that, Chinese thinkers would be listening to and looking to Western thinkers, especially when, Mao was pushing Hegel onto Kissinger.
Right.
Back. Sorry about that. Anyways, we ready to read through this?
Yeah. Go for it.
All right. Starting out. The evidence of Chinese power is everywhere, yet the motives that determine it are barely understood. The perception of the relative decline and stagnation of the West has promoted growing interest in a Beijing model of Chinese governance. But the dissonance between Western discussions of China and the ways in which Chinese intellectuals have conceived of themselves remains as deep as ever. This is true not just among critics of China, who have perceived it as an ideological competitor or totalitarian threat, but also in the disparate factions on both the left and the right. Each has used it as a canvas for their own political ambitions, a source of hope, of anxiety, or simply an aesthetic opportunity. And definitely, this is kind of weird. I think we're aware of it, but I've noticed that the left in general doesn't seem to be aware of this. I mean, we're aware, right, that American billionaires, well, not just American, but like Western billionaires, whatever, have for like the last 2 decades actually been talking about how much they like, the Chinese model of governance and how superior their form of capitalism is compared to ours, and how they would like to bring that to the United States. Right? I mean, people like Bill Gates have talked about those kinds of things. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of strange, and people might think, for the liberals, quite contradictory. What do you think, Hyperion?
That is correct.
Yeah, there's also I don't know if they were trying to reference this, especially when they were talking about the anxiety, the sort of populist American reaction to Chinese influence, through the Trumpist movement in particular, but also on many strands of the left are concerned with the growth of China, and especially the trade deals we have with China, the connections large companies might have with China.
Yeah, it's certainly connected with it. I mean, this actually also connects to just stuff long before China's ascendancy, which is stuff like, what is it, the Trilateral Commission, and didn't they have a report called the Problem of Democracy or something like that, in which they were complaining that the U.S. was becoming too democratic, and those dumb masses, the dumb proles were messing the global plans of the elites up a bit too much. So we had to do something about that. And I think it's those same people who very much love the Chinese model. They love not the communistic or socialistic aspect of it, but the aspect of control, or at least what they perceive as control. So anyways, continuing. During the Reform era, it became common wisdom to justify this lack of attention by claiming that Chinese people are typically pragmatic and non-ideological, or that official phrases such as socialism with Chinese characteristics are empty and irrelevant. Today, another tendency has arrived at the same end by interpreting these labels merely through aspirations already held by Western observers. Some Western socialists have sought, for example, to justify the existing Chinese political economy as a total alternative to the capitalist system in ignorance of the actual theory of the Chinese Communist Party, which often instead emphasizes a tight, non-binary connection between socialism and capitalism that goes beyond the dogmatic labels of surname socialism and surname capitalism, and admits the important role of the logic of capital in China. And I mean, that's totally true. As a matter of fact, Pierre and I just finished watching a certain dogmatic tanky of sorts, who kind of worships China as the alternative to capitalism, to U.S. capitalistic hegemony. And I'm certain he knows almost nothing about the Chinese standpoint on themselves, just as I know basically nothing about the Chinese standpoint on themselves. I mean, the most I know about Chinese philosophy is just that, is the basics that everybody knows. I know about Confucianism, I know a bit about Maoism, a little bit of Taoism, but beyond that, we live in extreme ignorance of how people in China really view the world. I was watching some videos this week about something related to that, and particularly of these Western individuals who moved to China, and how differently they encounter that Chinese people view the world. I mean, people talk about culture shock, but it's real, and it's not real like, oh well, just have these things that they do differently, but it's a fundamentally different view of the world, which leads you to behave and understand things in a very, very different manner. And it goes beyond just like, oh, well, they have different forms of dating, they have different forms of food, different forms of, what is acceptable in social relations and how those functions. But really, it's a completely different metaphysical view of the world.
Yeah, and I definitely noticed that with we watched this documentary, Chinese propaganda, but with like legitimate insight into how the Chinese government is tackling poverty. And one thing I noticed immediately was like how sort of like effortlessly, how sort of nonchalantly they throw around people's information. Like there's some aspect of the method in which they determine who is in poverty, where they get the whole town into a town meeting and they vote on whether they think someone is poor or not.
Yeah, a very different notion of privacy, if a notion of privacy at all. So yeah, I mean, this little point here would also bring up what a lot of Marxists, quote unquote, particularly left communists, hate about China. Which sort of like, it's not real communism, and this kind of already hints at what's going to come later, that China doesn't conceive communism by the book, by strictly what Marx says. In a way, I think that's actually very Marxist. I think that, Marx isn't somebody who wanted his writings and his theory to just be this holy book, of by the letter, which is unchangeable and which is, immune to error. And so, the fact that, they see, when they say surname socialism, surname capitalism, I think that's just, socialism in name or capitalism in name, that which people just call it. And that they fundamentally conceive them very differently. But let me go get my dog back inside. All right, back. Let's continue. The party theorist Yi Jiang.
Yes, Xiangming.
Oh, yes, Shanming. For instance, specifically repudiated the post-colonialist tendency developed in the West, which posits the existence of an Eastern path of development unique, separate, and even prior to capitalism. Quote, socialism with Chinese characteristics, unquote, according to Ye, means exactly the advanced and regulated logic of capital manifests as the particular development of the universal process. Ye's writing, however, have not reached the West. Holy shit, I agree with him.
Yeah.
Indeed, I think that's spot on. And for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about here, this is based on what initially seems like a highly abstract philosophical point of view. It isn't. There's a lot of concrete thinking going into it. But it's basically about the nature of what communism as such and socialism as such really are to be understood concretely, as opposed to just an abstraction of theory. What we have against, or I know at least me and Hyperion have against, can't speak for Josh here, but what we have against left communists, particularly this mode of abstraction, left communists have this obsession with what they call value theory, and about, if China was really communist, and if Russia was really communist, and the USSR and Cuba and all these other places, if they were really communist, they would have gotten rid of value form, which is a very fancy academic way of saying commodity production. Because if you get rid of commodity productions, the implications of that are massive. The implications of that are incredibly big. It means that anything that has to do with the relations of private property are completely annihilated and destroyed, because part of what is essential to the notion of private property is not only that things are, yours, but that they are yours to will over and to dispose as you please. So, if something like being able to exchange in a market, whether it is set up by the state or whether it's just, private market between individuals, black market, etc., if you can't do those things, it means that you have a certain relation to, well, it's even hard to say that, it's even property, right? You don't really have property in those things. And, they would say, you're exactly right, that, they are against property, they are against such notions, and they have this very utopian view in which somehow, humans can exist freely without those things. Now, it's not that they can't. Certainly you can have a society in which property can be abolished, but whether that would be a society you want to actually live in is a whole different issue. But my point in that is that concretely the meaning of socialism or communism before the synthesis of, which is just the matter of technology itself making capitalism irrelevant, getting the forces of production to the point in which there is such an abundance of things, Star Trek levels of production, in which the very notion of production as a social thing just kind of disappears, in the sense in which people are doing any human labor besides cognitive labors of development of the sort. Nobody has to make you a burger. Nobody has to make you a device. Somebody has to think things, sure, but beyond that, nobody's going to be laboring to create anything. You just materialize it out of thin air. At that point, indeed, markets have no meaning. There is no point in such things. But that's a completely different logic than economic logic. Economic logic, even in those kinds of situations, can still have a certain kind of meaning with a certain kind of sphere of things. And the meaning of communism and socialism for us is precisely that which is beyond economics. It's a sphere of life, it's a form of life, particularly a total form of life, a total social reality, which is not fundamentally organized around capital, which is to say that capital accumulation is not the primary purpose of that society. And I think that in China, you clearly see a society which is not organized for capital accumulation. People can say, oh, but it's state capitalist and all these other things. That really doesn't mean anything. That really doesn't mean anything. The state in China is 100% clearly not organized around the principle of capital accumulation. If it was, it would not be doing the shit that it's doing. It would not be running the kinds of social campaigns and the infrastructure campaigns that it's doing. It makes no sense. It's completely against that logic. And so, in that sense, is China socialist by that conception? Are they communist by that conception? In a way, I would say yes. Far more than probably any society ever has been. Probably the only thing that's more overtly political was the USSR. And in a way, in the USSR, that was part of the problem, that it was too overtly political and in denial of the economic reality. I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
No, well, I'd just like to say I do agree with point by point that argument against left communism.
Okay.
All right. So continuing, there are important exceptions to this lack of interest. One of the most useful and thorough attempts to engage with contemporary Chinese political philosophy has been the Reading the China Dream project, which has published an ongoing sequence of collaborative translations of prominent Chinese intellectuals. This series has shed light on important tendencies in Chinese political thought that are barely known in the West, including the Confucian integralism of Jiang King. Is it King or Jing?
Qing.
Jing. Why do they do that? I hate it.
I don't know.
Why do they still use the Q's even though they're pronounced as X's? I mean...
sorry, it's Taoism, not Taoism.
Exactly. God, I hate it.
Yeah, it's
Stupid
not very
academics. And the theory of state power, Jiang King, and the theory of state power of Jiang Shigang. Even here, however, the asymmetry between Western aspiration and Chinese intellectual reality seems to emerge unbidden in the favorable coverage and disproportionate attention given by the project to thinkers it classes as liberals. As broad as the scope of Reading the China Dream has been, and there will be recourse to it in this essay, the lingering suspicion remains that academics are most comfortable when they are imagining reflections of themselves. Jiang Shigang is a constitutional law professor who has established himself as one of the foremost Chinese critics of liberalism. He has contributed directly to the policymaking of the central government, particularly on Hong Kong issues, and has offered among the most authoritative expositions of Xi Jinping thought. In an age in which the star of Chinese liberalism appears to be fading, a more detailed study of the thought of intellectuals like Jiang may offer more correct disproportionate favor than Westerns have viewed it as. And I apologize for that noise. My dog suddenly wants to play by himself.
Oh, okay.
This cannot in itself... Oh, God.
No, sorry. I forgot what I was going to say, because... But it is Xi Jinping.
Oh, Xi. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what I think is interesting is the guy they brought up earlier, who's, they said, a Confucian integralist. Which is clearly not a liberal either.
Indeed.
Oh, Jiang. Yeah.
Actually, we have something about integralism in Brazil on the Left of Wreckage blog by my friend Tree.
By Contra. Yeah.
But, like, what would Confucian integralism even be?
Well, I mean, being honest, I mean, most Westerners, including myself, have very little clue as to what Confucianism even is. Beyond, you know, these platitudes we know about, or rather abstractions more like, about, you know, some sort of legalism, some notion of legalism and all these other things. We really don't know what Confucianism is or entails for the most part.
Yeah, when they're talking about Confucianism, they're referring to the intellectual movement of New Confucianism, which I'm not even aware about.
Yeah, because I thought, like, Confucius and everything associated with him was pretty much completely shunned out of, at least explicitly, out of Chinese thought after the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, that was just Mao. Like, that was Mao's own project. Like, immediately after Mao, there was, what was it, Deng Xiaoping was the next guy, or who was the next guy after him? After that, there was a resurgence in, you know, trying to bring back the traditions of China. And, you know, and that was what a lot of people noticed as, you know, a cultural conservative turn for China, which, you know, put a stop to the very, very chaotic revolutionary liberation that was attempted.
Jiang Qing was the main architect of that post-Mao thought under Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah,
so he's not just the obscure guy, you know, he's the main architect of that, though. The political Confucianism and mind Confucianism the dichotomy he created.
Yeah, and that stuff is actually very interesting, in which I think it's right to do, honestly. You know, I think that the Cultural Revolution, so far as they wanted to do basically what was it? What Pol Pot tried to do. You know, they wanted to do a sort of year zero, but not as stupid. And that is really not a good idea at all. I think it is a worthwhile project that if you have a clear cultural heritage that you can draw upon, there's no reason why you shouldn't draw upon it. Especially, I mean, if it's just already the cultural milieu anyways. You're not really going to win by trying to destroy the past. As far as I can tell, that takes generations to do. And usually, you don't even have to do this the level of complete destruction that China was attempting.
Well, so like the question is like, how much like positive ideas are there to even draw upon the heritage of Confucianism? Because I know even less than you guys do, but all we read about it just seemed like all bad.
Well, no, I mean, like, there's the ethical aspect of Confucianism, which is, impossible to rip apart from every other aspect, in which, it's not capitalistic. That's kind of fundamentally it. Yes, it's traditional, but it's not irrationally traditional. Like, there's a lot of reason. There's an attempt to rationalize the tradition itself in Confucianism, as far as I'm aware. In classical Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism is probably even more radical in attempting to rationalize that. And so it gives you a basis of, drawing up, your and a quote-unquote inherent, already in the background notion of the Chinese spirit. It gives you a rallying point of, this is who we are, this is what we stand for at the core. And these are the things in which, we're not going to budge just because of cultural trends elsewhere. The idea that everywhere has to somehow become westernized, I think, is an erroneous thing. The idea that, that the way that institutions are set up in the West is the only way to do it, I think is an erroneous thing. I think you can have different notions as a family. I think you can have different notions of, what certain forms of right concretely that you can have. What is right in one place may not be considered much of a right in any other place. Is that exactly wrong? Not really. The whole point of right is that it just has to have the proper form for it to be a right. But, as to how many rights and, what is considered to be more important or less important, that's sort of a culture's and a people's understanding of itself that is up to their own reasoning process about how they come to understand that. So, there's plenty of things you can take up from Confucianism, Taoism, and all these other things, and still intake Western knowledge, still intake the Western advances, and go, this is how we like these things. It's not just a syncretism either. It's not just like, you cherry pick it here and there, and you think that's that, which is what people mostly do anyways, but you can still rationally do it in such like, okay, these things are true, these things are valid, but, we have our own way of doing this, which is why I think the whole idea of, capitalism or socialism with Chinese characteristics is not an entirely stupid concept. There is a reason behind it in which they understand that that they accept that there is that there is a validity to certain Western concepts, but they're saying this is the way, given our culture, given our ideals, given the way that things concretely are here, how we're going to do it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have some hesitancy with the position. I know you're not a cultural relativist because I know we've spoken about this before, but there's still a thing okay, obviously not every place should have the same exact conceptions of right as the West necessarily does, but at the same time, some forms of right are just inherently superior to others in that they make people more free.
Yeah.
A lot of the notions of right in China, at least from what I can tell, are very They don't give that much freedom to the individual.
No,
Right.
because they serve the collective.
Yeah, and that has to do primarily with the Chinese spirit, the Chinese understanding of itself in the world.
Right. This is exactly what Dugin says as well. That you're not critiquing China on its own. You're not critiquing Russia on its own. You're critiquing it from a Western perspective.
Yeah, and that's actually what I was trying to get at. That it's up to them to decide what they self-determine to be the extent of freedom that they want. That's the meaning of what I'm getting at. That's so that that it's not like say like comparing it to Plato's Republic or anything, in which you create this ideal society abstraction, which is the error of a lot of the left in general. It's utopian in the bad sense, in which they just set these abstractions and they don't look at how these things really work. Anybody who's arguing on the West, like, oh, we're gonna get rid of the family, because the family is bad. Yeah, they're idiots. You're never gonna win. You're never gonna win. It's just like how Russia, they couldn't win against the church. You can't do it.
Yeah. You ought not win.
Yeah, and that too. I mean, you can't, and you won't, and you shouldn't, because certain things are set up and expected by a society. And just because you declare by fiat of law that now things are going to be different doesn't make it so. And, when people really don't want to do things, you can't win. You can go ahead and try to destroy the family and just make, you separate children from, their biological parents, put them all in these collective centers for child care and whatnot. You will reap what you sow in that, and what you sow is not exactly going to be good.
Well, it worked for Trump and Biden and Obama. Literally, just what you described is what they fucking do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and don't be surprised if in like 20 years we have a lot of terrorist attacks. Payback for something. All right, let's continue with this. This cannot in itself transcend the basic problems of cross-cultural projection and misunderstanding, which in the end infect not just Western discussion of China, but any dialogue between different frames of reference. Difference, however, is also more productive than identity. It is the task of the history of philosophy to map otherwise hidden trajectories that point beyond the limits of current intellectual assumptions. If all novelty in politics is driven by aesthetic induction, we should search not for pristine reflections, but for ciphers. Jiang Shigong's thought is worthy of consideration not just because of his explanations of Chinese policy or the possible future that he paints for a China politically and intellectually independent of the Western-led world order, but also because he raises questions that have been systematically under-examined in contemporary Western political thought. Shigong has garnered a mixed reputation among those who know him in the West, best known as a popularizer of Carl Schmitt, that's surprising, and more recently an expositor of the political theory governing China under Xi Jinping. He is being accused of embracing Maoism, quasi-fascism, and imperialism, of being a neo-Maoist, of reviving legalism, and of acting as a black hand in Hong Kong. Though Jiang is fond of producing provocative quotations, this reputation is to a great extent a disservice to his political theory, which is entirely systematic, if certainly not liberal. Well, I'm sure that, embracing Maoism and imperialism and neo-Maoism is not exactly an insult in China. Jiang's constitutional theory is, at its core, premised on the simple observation that a constitution cannot be abstracted from its real political context. Constitutional norms, as Schmidt once argued against Hans Kelsen, cannot defend themselves in the face of political force opposed to them, any more than liberal freedom can be defended by freedom itself. Observing the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine earlier in his career, Jiang saw a government ensnared in political paralysis as it attempted to face down an opposition that had renounced constitutional norms with liberal methods of negotiation and litigation. This was a government that had lost consciousness of its own sovereignty, the recognition that in a time of extraordinary crisis, political decisions must obey the will of God, not the Constitution. That's pretty radical for someone from China. I thought they didn't believe in God. By the way, don't kill me, it's a joke.
Okay, yeah.
Constitution cannot be abstracted from its real political context. I know he's read, this guy surely has read Hegel, and that's actually one of Hegel's claims in the philosophy of right, as well as in, the philosophy of history. He also talks about this, that, I don't know if it's in philosophy of right specifically. If it's anywhere, it's in that, but I know he also had other essays outside of his specifically philosophical work. And I'm aware of at least that he had a critique of Bonapartism, Napoleon's own attempts to extend his new form of liberalism outside of France onto other states. And the reason why he was against that is that as far as he saw it, he said, yeah, you can impose that in paper, but is that really the on-the-ground truth of what these people understand as the nature of their own state themselves? And the answer is that is 100% correct, that you can impose things on paper, but the reality of how people really understand their own political situation is a completely different thing. I mean, for what is it? India, for example, has the most complex and one of the most erudite constitutions in the world. There are a lot of rights stipulated in that constitution. There are a lot of things legally, for both how the political organs work and the way that things ought to function, that don't play out in reality. And the reason they don't play out in reality is because the reality is not a piece of paper. It's not by fiat. It's the same problem I have against left communists. Reality is not by fiat. You can't just state things and then make it into law and then go, bam, fixed, done. You need people who are actually willing to enforce it, and you don't need just one person. You need the entire apparatus to be filled by people who are willing to enforce it. And how is that apparatus filled? Well, by people who come from the regular, normal ranks of people who don't start as political, objects, who understand themselves as somebody who knows and wills those things that are right to be realized. Because, it's just in the United States, right, we have a lot of rights on paper. But when you get to the point of, these things concretely hit the ground, you don't have these rights. Why? Because there's a, quote-unquote, there's this forever present issue, seemingly, of, quote-unquote, corruption. And what is corruption really, other than the fact of the concrete denial that what is empirically, concretely the case, and, it's not exactly the proper word. It can be misunderstood when we say concretely empirical, but it's in the regular sense it is. In which the ideals of that constitution aren't the real ideals of people, right?
Yes. You mean the judiciary decrees?
Yeah.
Are not the will of the people.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like how Reformation, after the Civil War happened, tons of laws were put in place, but were they really enforced, and could they ultimately really be enforced? And the answer is that given how things panned out, no, they couldn't. Why? Because the people who had the general power, which is not an abstraction away from the general populace itself, it's not like it was just like, the politicians did it. No, these politicians were put in there by regular people. So it was also the general will of the people of the United States at the time that they didn't want to go along with those rules, and either they changed the laws or they left the laws, and they just didn't enforce them. And and at that point you can say, oh well, that's because the whole government apparatus is corrupt. But what does that really mean, other than that really wasn't what on the ground people understood of themselves and wanted for themselves?
Yes, but unmediated, of course, in this example. We're not saying that the people are right. In this case, James Madison is wrong. The people were not the only legitimate fountain of power.
Yeah, and well, I mean, the question was like, okay, how do you shift the general will on these issues? It was like shaped, it was changed significantly, not like as much as it should be, but
this is going to get into my Hegelian stuff if we go down the rabbit hole.
Well, I mean, there's no time limit. If you go as far. Like, my addition to that would just be that the way things change is also according to how people see and understand themselves. Even after the Civil War, there was still a notion in which, okay, even by the people who hated losing, nonetheless they accepted the loss. They accepted the Declaration as both an institutional legal thing and as just therefore a matter of something on the ground which they accepted that they lost.
They mostly abstract, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a very
concrete
abstraction.
It wasn't like they changed overnight,
No, yeah, there was resistance, but nonetheless, overall, they still accepted at least that much, right? Yeah, it's like the Trump people, in as much as they whine and bitch and complain, the reality is that implicitly, tacitly, they are still accepting what happens. Even though, they cry and complain about it, the reality is they still go along with it because, as part of their spirit, they have the law and order view of things. And so they don't want to destroy the nation yet.
Yeah, to that point.
Do you want to say something or do we continue?
No, we should continue. Although I want to read this 2004 Orange Revolution article later.
Yeah,
maybe not
on. So, it is his Schmittian insight that the Constitution itself depends on sovereignty that has led Jiang to articulate the theory of an unwritten Chinese Constitution, expressed summarily in a 2009 article on written and unwritten constitutions. The modern Chinese state, he argues here, was founded by a popular revolution that established a sovereign dictatorship of the Communist Party. It is the unwritten historical fact of this dictatorship, not the written document known as the Constitution of the State, which structures the whole of the Chinese Constitution and has embodied the continuity of the Chinese state through 3 successive written constitutions. Whether it is inscribed as an absolute dictatorship or a constitutional dictatorship subject to certain written limitations. When the relative position of the party and the state is brought into question, as in the unfortunate conflict between Mao and the chairman of the state, Liu Shaoqi, or Shaoxi, in the 1960s, it is the party, not the state, that has revealed itself to hold the crushing power of life and death. I think that I can agree with that to a certain extent. That goes along with what I was saying earlier about how the basis of the reality of the Constitution is entirely in the people as they will understand themselves. It's not an entirely arbitrary, abstract imposition that you can make just by fiat of a law. And likewise, actually this goes great with an example I love to bring up, which is, the sovereign citizen movement, insofar as it was a movement. It's been a while since we've heard about that. I think that kind of reached its peak 10 years ago, and then it kind of died down. There haven't been that many people in the news again. But what these people believe is basically this: they have a completely unrealistic belief that the word of the law is the actual sovereign force, which then dictates everything else. Which is why they think that if they can win by playing legalese games, that if they can just find the proper wording, the proper way to say things, somehow the legal system, the state, just has to go, oh, wow, well, they got us, and that they will fold. And of course, even if these people were right, it would mean nothing. Because it's happened before. It happens if you're black. It happens, if you're somebody the state wants to target, if you were a communist in the 50s, in which, you could say, but look, here exactly in the Constitution and in the law is this and that, and all they'll do is just, yeah, so what? And they'll do whatever they want to do to you. Why? Because the reality of power is not just in the letter of the law.
Right. So, what do you think about the party state distinction in the 60s, late 60s?
Well, I think here he is clearly identifying the party with the will of the people, which I don't think is
Mao's.
true.
Yeah. It was Mao's direction of the Red Guard. Liu Shaoqi was arrested because he was like, well, it is the state that ought to hold the power, not this cult of personality type thing. But Mao was like, we have to destroy all state and party institutions, and thus he was arrested. He was publicly beaten and so on.
Yeah, and I don't think that any party, can really be identified with the people themselves. It can happen. There can be a confluence, obviously, but I don't think essentially that's really the case.
He was the stand-in for state power because we're talking about the third most powerful person in China during Mao's reign, after Zhou Enlai.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a major disagreement, obviously.
Yeah, disagreement that Mao lost big time.
Well, yeah. I mean, short term, Liu Shaoqi lost it. But
well, I mean, I guess I got to take that back. I got to at least qualify that insofar as I know very little about Maoism, so I can't even say that I even know how Mao understood that whole situation either. So maybe.
Well, you're right. He was rehabilitated under Jiang. So, I mean, this was a major thing in the 80s. Jiang rehabilitated Xiaoqi.
Oh yeah, and so in the long run, yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Mao and his vision kind of lost power, but who knows about the
point here with this paragraph?
All right. The positivist and liberal currents of constitutional reformism that had gained currency in China in the 2000s were caught in a formalist obsession with the variance of facts from norms. They were unable to move beyond the written text of the Constitution to the more important substantive norms established by the unwritten Constitution of the dictatorship of the party. In fact, Jiang claims the Communist Party and the supreme organ of the state, the National People's Congress, constitute two bodies of the people analogous to the king's two bodies described in English law by Ernest Kantarowicz. The legally constituted NPC is limited and contingent. The party is absolute. The NPC is a rubber stamp, then is entirely by design. That the NPC is a rubber stamp, then is entirely by design. The party may adopt and dispense with written constitutions as it wishes. The state cannot dispense with the party. In this, I think that's empirically true, and insofar as we understand the party as being the national will of the people, that is true. But I think that gets to, when you make that identification, you're basically making the party a very undetermined concept that doesn't really tell us very much of anything. I mean, it's the equivalent to saying, well, you know, power, you know, in the Foucauldian sense, you know, it's like the abstraction. It's an abstraction, basically. Just the power is, you know, where the reality of action lies. Well, no shit.
Well, so what's the point of having the Congress, anyways, if the party has all the power? If the Congress is just a rubber stamp, why do they keep it?
I don't know, maybe it's sort of like the Hegelian notion of the monarch, in which, you know, the monarch is just a rubber stamp as well.
That's part and parcel to modern China, of course. Contemporary China.
No, but the king is more than just a rubber stamp. I mean, I don't know Hegel's system, but he's also like the head of state, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's at least the face of the state. He's the
the
individuality of the will of the state.
embodiment of the state, yeah.
But like, I feel like that isn't true about the Congress, because like Xi Jinping is, you know, he's obviously the face of the Chinese government, and I'm pretty sure he's the leader of the party, not the Congress. But he also has real authority.
Well, I think like this is kind of just saying, you know, giving another face to what they were saying earlier, which is just that, insofar as the reality of real political will lies with the people, that is the party, you know, we can't expect that, you know, the Congress is just there as just the official rubber stamp. You know, it's like you're doing something and then you enunciate that you're going to do it, you know, just as a confirmation. And then that's sort of what the function of the Congress is. And I think that, you know, logically that's, you can at least understand it in this way. That makes sense, you know, in that the action is really always begun by the party, and then the Congress is just there just to confirm it officially. You know, but it's going to get done no matter what. In that, you know, it's just the expression, it's the external appearance of that form of the will. Does that make sense?
I guess so.
And I mean, I can't say I understand this in a very deep level, because I don't really know how the politics of China are structured.
Camerally.
So, all right. To a large extent, Jiang has won this argument with the ascendancy of Xi Jinping, or Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping thought, he pronounced in 2018, uses modern legal thinking to perfect the party's leadership of the state. If not explicitly phrased as an unwritten constitution, a steady stream of communiques from the central leadership since 2012 has repeatedly reinforced the comprehensive leadership and ultimate sovereignty of the party over every sphere of the Chinese society. The defining characteristic of Xi Jinping's political program, indeed, has been his reassertion of the state and the party. I mean, that makes sense, especially in that, I mean, Xi has concentrated so much power that a lot of people, you know, keep comparing it. I think that back to Mao, that, you know, there hasn't been this concentration of like so much power in one person since Mao. Apparently, I mean, I don't know very much about that.
It's true, I think.
I mean, I was reading stuff years ago about, I mean, how much direct control he has. You know, he doesn't even offload it to just like, oh, well, I have this person take care of it. You know, that person always has to get it across through him. You know, and if he doesn't buy into what's going on, you know, it doesn't happen. I mean, people say, well, isn't that normally just what goes on in every state? Not really. I mean,
No.
in the U.S., there's still, the president doesn't bother to really understand everything. They have certain things that they'll focus on, and they will offload things to the vice president, offload things to the secretary of state, and and they will just get the lay of the land, and their advisors advise them. But with Xi Jinping, it's he has his own plans, and insofar as whatever his advisor advises him that doesn't fit into his plans, it doesn't seem he's going to go along with it unless they can convince him otherwise.
I do think he is sovereign, in a way that Mao was, and Deng was not.
Mm-hmm. But there's more to this emphasis on sovereignty and leadership than an assertion of party despotism. If there is a single hidden path of political philosophy to be found in Jiang, it is in his treatment of the problem of political space. It is, in fact, precisely this that he identifies in written and unwritten constitutions as one of the most important features of China's unwritten constitution, the relationship between the extensive control of the central government and the teeming diversity of localities that comprise the vast Chinese space. For Jiang, this relationship is embodied first and foremost in the doctrine of initiatives from two sources, an unwritten norm derived from Mao and developed successfully by
Deng Xiaoping.
Deng Xiaoping.
Yeah, and Jiang Zemin.
Jiang Zemin. According to this concept, policymaking in China is to proceed not simply according to bureaucratic dictates imposed from above, but through the interplay of both the top-down initiative of the central government and the bottom-up ambitions of the various different stratas of local government. As Mao says on the 10 major relationships, the provinces and municipalities, prefectures, counties, districts and townships should all enjoy their own proper independence and rights and should fight for them. The purpose of this doctrine is the preservation of heterogeneity. It is, of course, one of the more poorly kept secrets of political theory that Western liberalism is inimical to systematic political heterogeneity. In the West, it is largely critics of liberalism who have attempted to conceptualize possible ways to preserve and promote the existence of political heterogeneity. But even then, they have rarely dealt with in any satisfactory way with the distribution of this heterogeneity in space. Contemporary Western discussions of this problem, like seasteading, Singapore-style cities, charter cities, secessionism, and so on, have tended to focus on the right of competing social programs to be embodied in particular spatial units, while avoiding the problem of determining the setting that can enable these units' existence in the first place. It is the purpose of Jiang Shigong's emphasis on the comprehensive leadership of the party, in part to provide that setting by establishing a mechanism that can support, coordinate, and integrate these different models. And this is very interesting. So the most interesting thing to me in this whole thing, in which this reverses the biased assumptions we tend to have about the East, in which the East is the one that is against heterogeneity. They are the monistic, homogeneous entities. And the West is, the one that supposedly prizes freedom, individuality, and difference. And, here, of course, at least from Xian Shigong's point of view, this seems to be inverted. But it seems to be inverted in a Hegelian sense, in which, they're saying, no, what we want is difference in unity, in which we're going to provide the ground of differentiation, but we're not going to let these differences break apart. Which, at least on an abstract theoretical level, that sounds fantastic. That sounds like the way that things should function.
Difference in identity, multiplicity, and unity.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you told me about this, when you were describing the article, it kind of was a shock to me.
It gets more shocking because it's more radical than this, because I do think it has a very Mao's flavor. And Mao's version of dialectics are very oppositional, very chaotic, as opposed to the regular notions of dialectics that Marxists have. And it's not identical to the way that Hegel sees dialectic.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting. And I mean, this has been something that I've seen brought up as a critique from people who defend the one party states, whether it be the USSR, China, or Cuba, or anywhere else, in which they say, look, the differences in bourgeois capitalist democracies and whatnot are false, and it's true. It doesn't matter that you have 3 parties, 4 parties, 2 parties, an infinite amount of parties. The reality you always get is there is a pressure to conform to the homogeneous politics of what's this guy's name? Jiang, yeah, Jiang Shigang. What Jiang Shigang is talking about, the party, the party is the real locus of power. And that's true, that insofar as the party, the people are the real locus of power, it doesn't matter how many parties you have, it makes no difference. The real will of the people, the real force of power is going to be showing up some way, somehow, throughout all these. It doesn't matter that you have a million parties. It doesn't matter that you have one party. It makes no difference.
This is where James Madison was correct again.
Elaborate on that, because that I don't know as much about James Madison's thoughts as I do.
My favorite, the people are the only legitimate fountain of power.
There you go. I mean, so what is it? Marx says the truth of the state is democracy.
Yeah.
I suppose if you don't think philosophically, you're not used to thinking that way in concepts. It seems like a weird thing, and people think, oh, it should be democracy. No, Marx is saying literally the truth of the state has always been democracy. The demos is the power behind every state, no matter what kind of state it is. Doesn't matter if it's fascist, doesn't matter if it's dictatorial. No state can exist without people accepting it to exist.
Now, it doesn't mean that, the common people are always right. That's what we want to go towards, as Hegel says in The State, the substantial will of the people manifest and revealed to itself, accomplishing what it knows insofar as it knows it, having thought through all of these things, not just their immediate sensation or their collective sensation.
No, yeah.
But it does exist immediately in custom, as he says, and it mediates itself through the self-consciousnesses, their knowledge, and their activities. We just got to make sure. Well, I mean, this goes beyond this article, so I won't go there, but I think that's what he's going for.
Yeah, let's continue. Jiang articulates this concept at some length in his book, China's Hong Kong, in the context of the history of empires in East Asia. The historical Chinese empire, he suggests, was structured according to a Confucian differential mode of association that existed alongside the highly centralized legalist structure of counties and prefectures. Jiang sees this as in contrast to what he claims as insurmountable divides between political roles that emerged in the West, the paradigmatic examples being master and slave or noble and common. He claims political relationships and roles in the Chinese system were plastic, and different tributary states could succeed or fail to varying degrees in establishing states of ritual, thereby moving along the spectrum between barbarian and civilized. This process was observed from an imperial center that could at any point select between these various different systems and integrate their most positive results. The Chinese empire was not universal and homogeneous, but sustained instead by the pursuit of peaceful coexistence while maintaining differences.
Sounds like Cyrus the Great to me.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't this the way that Rome also basically ran their things, in which, they quote-unquote took over places, and they just made them tributaries, but then they just kind of basically let them run themselves, mostly. Insofar as so long as they provided tribute, they were fairly autonomous to a large degree. And this is what the ancient notion of empire always was, that not only was there a huge problem with like trying to centralize, so you really couldn't, but dealing with so many different varieties of people, there was an awareness that, well, you can't just impose the same on everybody. It's not going to work. You're just going to cause more problems for yourself. I mean, it's why Christian imperialism was so bloody, because you can't just leave things alone. You're in a constant combat on every front, not just political material, but just, in the hardest arena, which is cultural. And I mean, in the cultural arena, the most you can ever do is outright kill people, depending on how fast you want things to change.
Do you have anything?
Any thoughts, Josh?
I don't know. It's very interesting. I mean, you were talking about one point about unity and difference versus difference and unity.
Mm-hmm.
What?
Could you expound on that a little bit more? I thought you were talking about that.
Well, I mentioned difference and unity, and I did. I phrased it specifically in that way for that reason: difference and unity, as opposed to. I mean, overall, it means the same thing, but it gives a different emphasis, right?
Yeah.
If you say unity and difference, you're really you're putting the unity above the difference, and particularly unity here is more identity rather than just universal unity.
Yeah, the first has primacy, Josh. So saying difference in unity, you're putting emphasis on the difference. In unity and difference, you're placing emphasis on the unity.
And so, I mean, in the West, you see this, right? We have a unity and difference. We have the Democrats and we have the Republicans. But the reality is, like, practically, yes, there are certain differences, but the differences are such that in the long run, they're not differences at all. They basically function for the exact same purposes. They do the exact same shit. They fuck us in the exact same ways.
Yeah.
So apparency rather than, like how it actually is.
I mean, it's just like
Like they appear.
Yeah, it's just like capitalist markets. It's all about individuals and whatnot. But the reality is that there is no individuality at all. It's just a mass personalities in a way. Everybody's just an abstraction. Now, I'm not saying that that there is a proper success to that in the ancient empires. I think there was more success, but I don't think it was a fully proper success in that unification. In that, at least, just look at it compared to modern imperialism, right? A modern imperialism with Britain and the United States, and Spain and whatnot. They went and imposed their views on the world, and they didn't care like the ancient empires. The ancient empires valued cultural differences, not as differences, but so much as they saw that other people had certain forms of knowledge and certain knowledges that were worth uptaking. Whereas
with appreciation. Whereas with global domination of imperialism in our recent centuries, has been total domination.
Yeah, we just destroyed other cultures. We destroyed other knowledges, and we didn't take anything up.
If we did, it was like a byproduct of it. It wasn't this is something that we should implement, that we see as good.
No.
And I mean, and yeah, and it's,
Quote-unquote.
I mean that's part of the failure of the U.S., right? And it's like the U.S., the people of the U.S. It's not just like, oh well, why does Congress do this that? The people of the U.S. Do genuinely believe this stupid thing of American exceptionalism. We can't do what the rest of the world does because we're Americans. We're special. We can only do things our way. It doesn't matter if things are working in Britain. It doesn't matter if things are working in China. We can't do that. Those are Chinese people. We can't learn from them. They're just aliens of some sort.
There's either, you can talk about this. I think it's interesting.
Who?
Alexander Dugin.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's what was it? I think that's why Tree said Dugin's really the most interesting far right thinker nowadays.
All right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Quasi right.
Right-wing thinker.
I would put him within the dichotomy at that level. Like, I don't think the Nazis would agree with him, for example. But anyway, Dugin, I'm specifically referring to his argument with, what's his name? Francis Fukuyama, in which he called Fukuyama racist for treating Russians as the absolute other.
Well, that is true.
Or liberal. Yeah. I think he unequivocally won that debate. Yeah.
Let's continue.
Anyway, yeah, let's continue.
The old historical importance of one country, two systems is precisely its modern revival of this tradition. Deng Xiaoping's decentralizing appeal to respect particular historical conditions was not simply an expediency. History itself is a very source of political legitimacy, and the application of new models and infinitely heterogeneous conditions is the very essence of governing a large space. Ultimately, time and history are God. Well, I don't agree with that. A large political order must function as a setting for the intensive development of local models, but these local models cannot exist outside the ground provided by the extensive political order. This is the salient strength of empire, not the establishment of a total unity, but the enabling of heterogeneity within a great space.
With the God claim, we have to take into consideration the way that he quotes it. It's the same way that we say capitalism is God, I think. Not literally.
Well, no, yeah, I mean, this is a typical Marxist thing, though. I mean, it's historicizing of the absolute, which is not properly true. It's like the same thing as like people like Pinkard and whatnot who say like, oh well, it's society is God ultimately. Well, it's a manifestation of God, but no, it's not.
Maybe the mind of God.
But I mean, we're not arguing theology here.
Yeah, it's not theology. It's about the importance of time and history in this context.
So, continuing, on a larger scale, it is this framework that explains Jiang's focus in a more recent article on the construction of a world empire 2.0. Drawing on geopolitical theorists such as Halford Mackinder, Jiang argues that the history of civilization is a dialectical interplay between the heterogeneous empire form and the homogenizing state. Until the colonial era, the major world civilizations had found their ultimate expression in traditional regional empires, China in the Far East, the Caliphate in the Middle East, or the Christian Empire in the Far West. The emergence of colonialism sundered the remnants of the medieval Christian imperium into new competing empires that came to span not just one continental region, but the whole planet, and propelled the European states into a position of immense material superiority over all the traditional regional empires. The doctrine of national sovereignty, the traditional hallmark of the modern Western theory of the state, emerged only at the edge of the competition between these European-led world empires, bleeding out of their destructive interactions in the European heartland itself. Empire, in fact, precedes the modern nation-state, not just historically but also logically, and the sovereign states of the contemporary world were comprehensible only as moving parts of the single world empire that triumphed in this colonial struggle, namely the American Empire, whose defeat of the Soviet project in the Cold War represented the victory of a particular maritime commercial model of world empire over a land-based spiritual ethical alternative. This world empire now includes China itself. China and Russia too are situated with the American-led system. No country can exist outside it. They can only rebel against the empire from within. I mean, I can agree with most of that, insofar as I know anything about it. I don't know much about a concept of empire. I haven't thought about it very much. I'm sure Hegel has something to say about it in philosophy, right? It ends with that, doesn't it? Something about...
But, I mean, we know that the world empire exists.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fact, but I don't know, like... I mean, in a way it makes sense that the notion of nation states only really arises with the arising of empires. Because that's the only place in which the political internal differentiation, which concretizes that individual states, really makes sense. You know, there's no reason to have a state in abstraction.
Mm-hmm.
At least from a certain point of view. There's not a certain point of view in which I think that one can still have a state without that. But in our current knowledge of history, yes, it seems that that's kind of where it goes. And they probably would also make sense that logically one can speak about that too. But this also brings to the point about against a critique of a lot of the Marxist left. A lot of people who say, well, come on, you got to end commodity production, you got to end value forming. Why are you doing this? Why aren't you doing that? Venezuela should have done this and that. And it's like they forget that we do live in a world system. That you can't, as an individual nation, you don't actually have this. You may be legally sovereign, but the reality of your sovereignty is tied to that world system. A lot of your material well-being is tied to that world system, and if you want to disconnect to that world system, you are giving up. You're giving up a lot of what constitutes modern life as a whole. You're giving up a lot of you're giving up a lot of access to technology. You're giving up a lot of access to knowledge in general. You're giving a lot of access to connections to world culture in general. If you decide to just go off the grid and say, we're just going to isolate ourselves and develop communism that way, good luck, having a society that's more than just fucking, starving farmers.
Kind of brings me to the idea of like the previous world empires not being world empires as such. Like the Americans didn't know about Rome or Cyrus or.
Yeah, they
now it's impossible.
Yeah, this is a reality of world empire. Those other empires certainly aspired to, but they couldn't.
Which I want to read World State of Emergency by Giorgiani, but I do think that this is the same as what.
Yeah, I mean, he's for world empire. He thinks we need one, and I think as time moves on, and we become a global. I mean, we already are, but we're truly in the nascent stages of it. We are a global culture.
Yeah, but not unified in a positive way.
Yeah, we are a global culture, but we're not conscious of it yet.
We're reliant on each other, rather than, I don't know, empowering. It doesn't matter, but
yeah, I mean, we're implicitly a global culture. We're not yet conscious and willing of it.
Right.
All right. Jiang's concern in this article is once again Jiang's concern in this article is once again the problem of political space, the internal logic of very large political entities. Empire represents the balancing of a centrifugal logic of diversity against the homogenizing engine of a central state. In the traditional,
That's perfect. Yeah, that's a perfect description.
In the traditional regional empires, this contradiction worked itself out through a slow process of cultural and bureaucratic assimilation. With modern colonial empires, by contrast, this type of resolution was foreclosed by the perpetual status of colonized regions as areas of exploitation with no claim to participation in the metropolitan sovereign state. The establishment of a true world empire has returned this problem to its beginnings. The world empire must be able to provide a mechanism for coordination on a planetary scale, while at the same time facilitating the coexistence and productive competition of widely different modes of political organization. The liberal American-led world empire is now failing in this delicate task, and so, Jiang argues, it is China's responsibility as a dissident force within the present empire to contribute to the construction of a new model that will be able to maintain the suspension of these imperatives. Given the anti-liberal direction of Jiang's theorizing, it may seem surprising that he is fascinated, even haunted by Hong Kong. Yet in the context of the imperial question of space around which his political thought revolves, this focus makes perfect sense. Jiang sees an astute and fiercely effective model in the historical British administration of Hong Kong. If antipathetic Westerners and the more unreflective of Chinese nationalists both now see in Hong Kong merely the question of managing the decline of a recalcitrant and increasingly irrelevant city trapped in its colonial past, in Jiang's work the problem posed by Hong Kong is quite the opposite. Hong Kong, if anything, is the most important problem of Chinese politics. The existence and perpetuation of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region is manifest and indispensable proof of the capacity of the Chinese political order for experimentality, the coordination of multiple opposite systems. Hong Kong, Jiang has said, is a fulcrum from which to lever the Western world. More than that, as he argues in China's Hong Kong, the relationship between Hong Kong and the central Chinese government is the template for a future nomos of the earth. The handling of the Hong Kong question does not mean handling matters arising in Hong Kong, but handling the core issues of the rejuvenation of Chinese civilization. It is no mistake, Jiang says, again, that there is one country in the slogan, one country, two systems, rather than one state. This country is not a nation state, but a wider imperial political order that tracks the edges of an ancient empire. One country and systems. For this reason, the absurd goal of identity between Hong Kongers and other Chinese is for Jiang the saddest page in the tragic modern history of China. Since 2019, the fires burning in Hong Kong seem to threaten the destruction of an archetype, the immolation of a Chinese-led reconstruction of the world order before it can truly even begin. In this context of tension, Jiang has warned against arguments that make the present Hong Kong conflict a struggle between competing material systems of capitalism and socialism. He had instead emphasized the postmodern ideological and cultural character of the conflict and the need for the Chinese central government to proceed with circumspection. The lethal problem is not, in reality, the contradiction of developmental models. It is the stubbornness of an identity that seems to resist coordination. This is the contradiction faced by Jiang's model of political experimentality, the ability to coordinate and select effectively between competing developmental models while avoiding ensnarement in the postmodern cultural ambitions that are projected around them. Just as the development of society is propelled by its contradictions, the development of world empire can proceed only on the basis of difference, not its resolution, but its productive suspension. The ability of the Chinese constitution to deal with the emergence of local identity in Hong Kong is the ultimate test of this broader model's feasibility. And this is what I was telling you that reminds me, like, this clearly has the traces of Mao's views on it. This was Mao's idea of, I don't know specifically what the name is. It's not the mess line, but it's his idea that, that there has to be a constant bringing up of, the tensions of opposition. And, that they have to be played out as oppositions, that, we're not going to have this coming to terms and, rational understanding, which is, what Hegelian developmental dialectic works as, sublation in a way. And instead, it's you just constantly bring the oppositions to bear and have them, duke it out in a way. That you just have tension just brought out explicitly in the open. And this fully doesn't make sense to me. it strikes me as just sort of an abstract utopian idealist view of differences, in which it's a belief that we can have fundamental differences, and yet that somehow we can really have this in a harmony. And I don't think that really works out. I don't think you can have a world in which some part of the world is capitalist and the other part of the world is communist, and that there's going to be some sort of peace between these, because these are two competing views of world system. They're not subsets of each other. Insofar you cannot have them subsist in that way, insofar as you're not willing to bring them under one single logic which they both share.
Yeah, but there is a mutual interdependence right now that doesn't want to escalate to physical conflict. Just at the present moment. Yeah.
Right, and part of this is precisely because of that identity. That identity has been the economic mutual dependence. Were it not for that, the antagonisms would be much, much greater. I mean, what was it that the American capitalists said? When Russia happened, the problem with communists is that we can't do business with them. That was their main thing. We can't exploit them for resources the way we can exploit other people in trade deals or whatever. Otherwise, that's why American democracy allows for a whole bunch of local things. Of course, they tend towards tyranny, because that's just a power play. But they don't particularly care about whether that's a benevolent tyranny or not, insofar as they get their economic play out of it.
That's still the issue. The ruble isn't connected to the dollar.
Yeah. That's another thing.
Well, it's also why it seems like the West, or at least Western business, is all right with the rise of China. So they can do business with them. And they do a lot of good business with China.
Yeah, they do. And so, in a way, this is sort of turning towards this indifferent capitalist logic, which I don't think really works. Because insofar as people say, oh, well, the economics is just an indifferent thing, it's not. Ultimately, it's not. It's not in the sense that, capital cannot be controlled and whatnot. You look at China, it totally can. And if things end up going wrong in China for whatever reason, some sort of economic collapse, it would happen just as much under a planned economy. Problems always arise. You can't foresee everything. There's a lot to planning. But the thing about Hong Kong, I think, is just it's sort of idealist to look at that. It's like, it's a sort of a proving the Chinese experiment that we can hold together despite these differences. When it comes to the reality of concrete life, those differences only hold precisely because you don't really have that much of an intermix between these societies. I think that the drive is towards at least a form of homogeneity. What we were talking about earlier, but the different forms of right, even though, sure, there can be a local difference between, the notions of the family and what that is and whatnot. Nonetheless, the right of family seems universal. And not only seems, but I would say is universal. And those things, at least in that formal aspect, homogenize. concretely, they're going to be different. We all need food, but we don't all eat the same food. It's that same kind of difference. And I don't think Hong Kong in the relation to China is that kind of difference.
Yeah, but you're not speaking culturally, you're speaking individually. Just to clarify. You're not saying like the Chinese eat different food than we eat in the West.
Oh, yeah,
You're saying
I'm saying, but it applies to any.
Yeah.
It applies to any individuality. But I mean, with political individualities, that's a whole different ballgame. I mean, in political, it's not really just political. It's social individuality. It's the state individuality as a total social organism. When you really do have two different systems, if you don't have at least a basis of unity, there is nothing to be done between you. I mean, in this case, like Hong Kong isn't some great threat to China. There's nothing Hong Kong can do to China. China wins out that whole thing. But between equals, what happens is, I think, either unspoken, either there's a hostility, or even if there's not a hostility, there is an unspoken mechanism in which homogenization starts taking place. Which, I mean, I don't think Jiang Shigong is saying really anything against that. I mean, I think that's what the backdrop of empire is, and which he's saying, like, well, the empire sort of this backdrop of the possibility allows these things to be possible, and then, insofar as certain things will start working better or not, the empire then works as a mechanism of, sort of shifting and allowing other places to take up these better ways. Right, it's like we were watching that thing about poverty, Josh, in which they don't force people to move out of their rural, farms and whatnot. They give them, the choice of seeing the models and saying, look, go try it out, go see how it's like, see if you like it, see if you want to try that. And indeed, China is very experimental compared to the U.S. I mean, they're doing various things with various cities. They built some eco-cities. They've been trying different things, more so than the West is. I mean, they're differentiating themselves a lot. They're doing a lot of things at the same time. They've been doing solar. They've been doing where they can do solar, they do solar. Where they can do wind, they do wind. Where they can reclaim land, they're doing experiments to reclaim land. They've literally. And they do it just because they can, because indeed, I think that does follow this logic of differentiation of, trying specific things certain ways and seeing if they work out or not. And whether they work out, it doesn't suddenly become like, oh, this worked out here, now let's do it everywhere. It seems, they got more tact than that, in which they're like, well, this worked out here, now these other places in China can look at this and see if they want to take it up or not. So let's continue. There's nothing new even to Westerners in the idea that there is something in modern China that is radically different and new to the conceptual inventory of the West. The Italian theorist Ugo Spirito, who fell out of favor with the fascist regime for its left-wing interpretation of corporatism, authored, hey, look, literally a left-wing fascist, authored a largely forgotten booklet on Russian communism and Chinese communism. After visiting both the Soviet Union at the end of Stalin's rule and the People's Republic of China in the 60s, he argued that Maoism had transcended the materialist bias built into Marxism, where Western communists were concerned only with economic questions and had reduced the goods of life to promoting living standards of individuals. China had established a true organic unity, a system in which nothing individual existed in alienation from the collective, a total state rooted for all Mao's protestations firmly in the primordial legacy of Confucianism. 30 years later, some Western commentators saw in the Far East a dissipation of top-down collective destiny into capitalism and special economic zones, the complete opposite of the dreams of Hegelian unity that had commanded the affection of intellectuals like Spirito. China was seen as the center of white-hot planetary deregulation unburdened by guilt, exclusivity, and bad faith of the West. Really, China was consummately materialist, and that was no bad thing. These two responses refract through their foreign cultural prisms particular moments in the course of China's modern development, projecting the contrasting images of China in the eras of Maoism and reform. In fact, just as Xi Jinping has sought to synthesize and resolve both these moments into continuous historical narrative of party leadership, there is something in Jiang that speaks to both of these views. He has emphasized the sublation of communism into an organic spiritual ideal as much as the experimental development of productive forces. What is distinctive, however, is this folding of these perspectives into the question of political space, seeking to justify a comprehensive leadership system precisely in order to promote and maintain intensive bottom-up organization within an extensive political framework. Yet it is a mistake to read Jiang as a passive expositor of China's present self-image. China is increasingly confronted with the rest of the world by the prospect of an indefinite stagnation, an advancing great horizon, relentlessly dashing every hope for new politics. Jiang's concept of a spoke and hub, Tianxia, that can provide the force and the framework for intense experimentation is, in this context, a critique. It attempts to ensure the continuation of technical and social development and the construction of novel forms of politics by manually harnessing the impulse of social contradictions into an engine for the production of new futures. Jiang's work has been interpreted as a triumphalist panegyric for the revival of Chinese power and as a self-serving justification of the party line. But in formulating this idea, Jiang is far from acting as a triumphalist. He appears instead as an impatient critic of a social reality that falls well short of his ideal and that extends all across the existing world empire. The repair of this reality will in fact, be a planetary enterprise demanding a long and terrible will beyond the limitations of existing Chinese politics, an enterprise that China can catalyze but cannot complete on its own. So that's a very interesting article, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Tianxia, under heaven, reminds me of, the famous Mao quote, "There is great disorder under the heavens." Situation is excellent.
Yes, it does. I don't know, has anybody said anything in the chat? I haven't been looking at the stream, obviously.
Nothing. No questions, really.
All right, well, that was a good read. It's been a long time since we did this. I enjoy doing these things.
Yeah.
I think it's good food for thought on the fly. We learn some things, we think some things. So for all of you watching, thanks for watching. I'd be meaning to try to do these things more often. We'll see how often we could do it. Because once I start work somewhere in like mid-late April, I will have no time until probably September, late September. So, all right, we'll leave it at that. See you guys.
Yeah.
Yep. How does say goodbye in Chinese?